Hello and welcome to the Musical Instrument Investigator. Today we're on the website of Amati Auctions based in the UK. We're going to have a look at their latest auction, the Amati Affordable, which is finishing on the 27th of July. So these particular auctions, the affordable ones, are for things that are kind of in need of repair, have unknown provenance, or kind of other various things which make them in general a bit lower value. But sometimes you can have stuff which is quite interesting, so it's not exactly always clear cut like that. This particular auction, the buyer's fee is 22%, so whatever the final hammer price is, you need to add that on top. This is a UK based auction, as I said, so check all the kind of shipping fees and things, and if there's any CITES restrictions and all of that kind of stuff that you might need to be aware of. So as I said, this particular auction is finishing on the 27th of July. It's the 24th as I'm recording this particular video, so you've still got a few more days left, and I'll put a link in the description. I think there's just over 900, just over 280 items in this auction. Thank God it's not 900, because that would be quite tiring. Yeah, about 280 or 283 odd items in this auction, so quite a fair amount. But not too crazy. So as there's quite a lot of things to get through, I think let's just get on with it really, and see what we have. We'll try and kind of speed through. So we've got a cello unlabeled. Current bid is £10. We won't go to all the condition reports unless it's something really interesting. Looks fairly standard. Cello unlabeled. This is a bit of an odyssey here. 210 the bid. It looks like some of the interesting kind of regional English kind of things that you got outside of London, so that's curious. Looks like it's got some pretty bad work, crack on the back of scroll, extensive damage, new bits, open cracks, all sorts, nasty kind of soundpost crack on the back, but interesting, like pretty bizarre looking cello, so definitely an interesting one there. Cello unlabeled. No bids on this so far. The bids have seemed to be very slow, although most of the bids usually happen right at the end with Amati. They are particularly slow this time around, I've noticed. Not sure why that is. Cello unlabeled, that's an interesting looking cello. £750 already on that. Let's see, some repairs there. Yeah, interesting looking F-hole spacing there. Small cello unlabeled. £10 bid on that. It's probably not really worth mentioning the bids at the moment. Another unlabeled cello there, 50 current bid. Once again, kind of interesting F-hole spacings there. Another unlabeled cello. This just seems to be the unlabeled cello zone. Yeah, needs a bit of work on that. 3/4 size cello, labelled imported by Boozy and Hawks. This looks like your fairly standard type thing. Cello labelled the header sign. It's probably a Chinese or Romanian made cello. Back onto violas now. A viola labelled A.R. Payne MacLeith. Interesting. It's in good condition. Let's see what the measurements are. 414 length of back, that's good length. Baroque viola labelled Ludi Workshop, current bid's 60. This is definitely Chinese viola for sure. I wonder what the length of back is actually. 377, yeah, it's quite small. Viola labelled Rudolf Fiedler, 403, it's the length of back there. Viola branded George Reinl, 391 there. Nothing too outrageous. Viola labelled Klaus Schlegel, 410 length the back. Viola labelled Edward Elliott, Monk Seaton, 1913, 380. That is pretty small. That's slightly more kind of interesting shape to it, kind of almost amateurish work. Viola labelled copy of Antonius Stradivarius, made in Western Germany, 396. That looks like your standard trade instrument. On to bows here. Silver mounted cello bow stamped Maestro Archetier. Nickel mounted cello bow unstamped. Nickel mounted cello bow stamped Mary Cocker. Nickel mounted cello bow unstamped. Silver mounted cello bow stamped Alban Hums. Nickel mounted cello bow unstamped. Silver mounted cello bow unstamped. Nickel mounted cello bow stamped Rushworth and Draper. Nickel mounted viola bow unstamped. Silver mounted viola bow stamped L. Cocker. These are the previous bow actually are these bamboo bows with the kind of head grafted on, or supposedly anyway, that Lawrence Cocker made, so I presume the other one potentially kind of a continuation of the family business. But these are interesting bows, and we might be going this way again soon if Pernambuco is going to get kind of banned. We might be looking at these interesting bows again. Silver mounted viola bow stamped Andrew Bells. Silver mounted viola bow stamped L. Cocker, interesting. Nickel mounted viola bow unstamped. Nickel mounted violin bow stamped Lupo. Silver mounted violin bow stamped JTL. Silver mounted violin bow stamped Neudorfer. Silver mounted violin bow stamped A. Vigneron, a Paris. Silver mounted violin bow stamped Dodd. Silver mounted violin bow stamped Penzel. A Baroque bow stamped DVE. This is probably by David Van Edwards, but I can't see the stamp, but it looks like his style. The wood is probably amaret, so kind of like plain snakewood, basically unfigured snakewood. Baroque bow stamped JY Matter. Baroque bow stamped Volta Metal. A nickel mounted violin bow stamped Grimm. Nickel mounted violin bow stamped Eric Steiner. Nickel mounted cello bow unstamped. A violin bow stick unstamped. A violin bow stick there. Nickel mounted violin bow unstamped. Nickel mounted violin bow unstamped. Nickel mounted violin bow unstamped again. Another nickel mounted violin bow unstamped. Violin bow unstamped. Violin bow unstamped. Silver mounted violin bow unstamped. Nickel mounted violin bow unstamped. Nickel mounted bow unstamped. Silver mounted violin bow unstamped. Nickel mounted violin bow unstamped. Nickel mounted violin bow stamped HR Frechner. Nickel mounted violin bow unstamped. Nickel mounted violin bow unstamped. Quite a lot of bows in this auction. Nickel mounted violin bow unstamped. Silver mounted violin bow stamped W. Walton. Nickel mounted violin bow stamped Malene. Nickel mounted violin bow stamped J. Martin. Nickel mounted violin bow stamped Poisson, a Paris. A violin bow stamped unstamped. Nickel mounted violin bow unstamped. Nickel mounted violin bow unstamped. Silver mounted violin bow stamped L. Cocker. Silver mounted violin bow stamped Mary Cocker. Silver mounted violin bow stamped B. Tunnicliffe. Now these I think are definitely by Brian Tunnicliffe. Having looked at these, this looks like his kind of work, and he's still going, I think, at 90 or so, or close to 90 years old, so I'm not surprised that the bids are a bit higher for that. And this one also the same, so I think his costs are probably a lot higher than that at the moment for a bow. It's got to be over 2,000, I would have thought, so sure some people will be interested in that. Nickel mounted violin bow stamped Dodd, violin bow unstamped, silver mounted violin bow stamped Jerome Abril, silver mounted violin bow unstamped, a baroque bow unstamped, a baroque bow by Lundver, a baroque bow unstamped, baroque bow stamped Landwehr. A lot of baroque bows actually in this auction, it's quite true. 6 violin bows varying lengths, 6 violin bows varying lengths, a violin labelled Sanctus Seraphim. So we're here on to the violins. Looks kind of okay. 550 is the current bid. I suppose it looks in fairly good condition. Violin labelled Joseph Edmondson, Cheshire. This looks like your kind of amateur made violin made from the Heron and Allen book. Violin labelled Jacobus Steiner. This just looks like your standard trade violin. Violin unlabelled. Yep, nothing too crazy there. Another violin unlabelled. This looks like it's been either revarnished or fiddled about with. Violin unlabelled. Yep. Violin labelled Jacobus Steiner. Nothing too exciting there either. Baroque violin labelled Timothy Littler, newer Contrent, 82, current bid 450. Interesting enough, baroque violin there. Violin unlabelled. Another violin unlabelled. I think we're going to have a lot of unlabelled stuff in this auction. Violin unlabelled again. It has some interesting varnish as well. A violin labelled copy of Nicholas Amati. Nothing too exciting there. 3/4 size violin unlabelled. Looks kind of okay. Violin unlabelled. Violin unlabelled again. That's a horrible repair there on the button. Violin labelled Wilhelm Dürer, Eilsburn. Looks fairly standard. Violin unlabelled, fairly interesting looking. Scroll is interesting, but the top does look quite interesting on that violin. Another violin unlabelled. This looks pretty standard type thing. Violin labelled Nicholas Armatus. Once again, just another tradey kind of violin. Violin unlabelled. Yep, nothing too exciting here. Violin unlabelled again. Yep. Violin labelled Nicholas Armatus. Most of this stuff is just very plain. Violin labelled Antonius Stradivarius. A violin labelled copy of Antonio Stradivarius. Violin labelled Viola, Paris. Violin labelled Antonio Stradivarius. This looks like someone's been at the top with a, well, the whole thing with a screwdriver. That is probably the prime example of screwdriver antiquing there. Her violin labelled C major. Violin labelled copy de Antonio Stradivarius. Violin labelled John Baptiste Allo. Violin labelled Alexandre Galeano, 120 is a bid on this. Just looks like a fiddled about varnish on that one. Violin labelled Marlborough. Violin unlabelled. Once again, slightly over the top antiquing on that. Violin labelled Konya Istvan. Violin labelled Antonio Guadagnini. Violin indistinctly labelled. Seven-eighths violin labelled Nicholas Amatus. F hole's quite close to the edge there. Quite a nice back on that actually. Quite interesting. Looks quite narrow. I wonder what the length of back is on that. Body length 346. Yeah. Interesting. Violin labelled Louis Lowendahl. And kind of bird's eye back there. Violin branded Duke. Interesting F holes there. Interesting looking violin. It's had a lot of problems there. Lots of worm and things, but interesting nevertheless. Repaired by JTL, which is kind of interesting. Violin labelled J.W. Watkinson Birkenhead. £100 bid on that. Interesting. Violin labelled František Zalud. Some pretty interesting F-hole placements there. And a very tradey lion head. Half-size violin. Very normal. Labelled with a map. Interesting. Violin labelled Jacob, Paris. Violin labelled Jacobus Steiner in Absam. Another one of the lionhead ones. Half-size violin unlabelled. Looks interesting enough. Violin unlabelled. Half-size violin circa 1910. Violin unlabelled. Three-quarter size violin unlabelled. Interesting looking back. Violin labelled model of Jacob Steiner. Looks fairly standard violin, faintly labelled. Oh, the pictures have gone a bit weird. Current bid 110. Slightly interesting. Lots of repairs. Interesting scroll actually. Wow, so extensive damage. Well, there's a lot of new bits of wood everywhere, so that's a bit of a project for someone. Violin unlabelled. Another violin unlabelled. Violin labelled, repaired by R.D. Carr. It looks a little bit messed around with, unfortunately. Current bid is 30. Let's just have a quick look at the scroll again. Yeah, it's definitely been messed around with a bit. Violin unlabelled. This is a curious looking instrument, this one. Look, that is absolutely shocking button repair. Interesting scroll. I'm quite curious to know how old this is, because this kind of does look like it could be quite old actually. So that's an interesting one, that one. Violin labelled Casper de Salo. Another standard instrument. Violin unlabelled. Violin unlabelled again. Interesting inlay there in the back. Violin labelled Paolo Magini. Violin unlabelled. A violin signed J.D. Wedford, Huddersfield. Nice back on that actually, that's quite nice. It's good, £10 bid on that. It's quite a nice, interesting, probably English violin. Violin branded at Lambert. That's okay. Violin labelled Antonius Stradivarius. Violin unlabelled. Violin signed internally. That's another interesting looking one. Three-quarter size violin labelled Antonius Stradivarius. Three-quarter size violin unlabelled. Another three-quarter size violin unlabelled. So it's all pretty standard. Three-quarter size violin unlabelled. Three-quarter size violin, so a lot of three-quarters again. Three-quarter size violin labelled Companion. Three-quarter size violin unlabelled. Ooh, wrong button. Three-quarter size violin unlabelled. Another three-quarter again. Three-quarter size violin labelled the Maidstone. Another three-quarter labelled Antonius Stradivarius. Three-quarter size violin labelled Breton. Another three-quarter labelled Maidstone. Another three-quarter labelled Maidstone. Half-size violin labelled the Maidstone. Three-quarter size violin labelled Maidstone. Well, there's a lot of Maidstones in this auction. I mean, there's a lot of them floating about. violin labelled Jean-Baptiste Viola, Paris. Violin labelled Thomas Jacqueline, Hull. It's interesting back there. Some big crack on the front. Violin unlabelled. It's an interesting looking thing. So varnish is a bit curious on that. Violin labelled the Essex. Another kind of interesting looking violin there. 3/4 size violin. Violin labelled Ajadius Klotz. Seven/8 size violin labelled Antonius Stradivarius. 3/4 size violin labelled Antonius Stradivarius. Violin labelled Antonius Stradivarius. Violin faintly labelled. Violin unlabelled. Three-quarter size violin labelled Nicholas Amatus. Definitely a good auction if you want a 3/4 violin. Half size violin unlabelled. Violin unlabelled. Violin labelled PK. Violin branded Herald. Violin unlabelled. Another violin unlabelled here. Violin labelled the Maidstone. Some more Maidstones. Violin labelled Viola, Paris. Violin labelled Johannes Gottfried Dürfel. Violin labelled Nicholas Amatus. Violin labelled Jean-Baptiste Viola. Violin labelled Carlo Testori, Milano. It's had a lot of unfortunate repairs, front half edged. Violin unlabelled. Interesting, unfortunate repairs there, but some interesting remnants of varnish and things on that. Violin unlabelled that has been partially stripped, it seems. It's a bit of a project one. Violin labelled Companion. Violin unlabelled. It's fairly standard. Violin unlabelled again. Violin unlabelled. Violin unlabelled. This is the affordable auction, so it's a lot of kind of unknown speculative things, unfortunately. Violin labelled Copy de Antonius Stradivarius. Violin unlabelled. Interesting crackulature on that varnish there. Quite curious. Actually, the eye of that scroll is Very neat. The F holes are quite neat as well. It's quite a neat scroll. Violin labelled JTL and C. Violin unlabelled. Violin labelled J Wilson at Manchester 1880. Violin labelled Antonius Stradivarius. Violin labelled Schuster and Co. Violin labelled Piano Student Violin. Three-quarter size violin. Violin labelled FJ Mertz. The internet is not wanting us to have a look at this picture. Okay. Three-quarter size violin, unlabelled. Violin unlabelled. Violin labelled Francesco Ruggieri. Three-quarter size violin. Violin unlabelled. Violin unlabelled. Violin labelled Enrico and Raul Politi. Violin labelled Simon Kreiner, Mittenwald. Violin labelled La Vie de Padoue. Interesting looking back on that. Violin unlabelled. Kind of curious looking thing. Violin unlabelled. Half-size violin labelled Lark. Violin labelled Christian Hoffman. Violin labelled Antonius Stradivarius. Violin labelled Bartolomeo Tassini. Violin labelled Paul Bish, Lutheran. That's an interesting looking F holes and arching there. Definitely quite curious. Violin unlabelled. Interesting head on that one. Violin unlabelled. Looks like it has quite high arching there. Violin labelled Antonius Stradivarius. Violin unlabelled. It's had some unfortunate repairs already. Yeah, very unfortunate. Three-quarter size Baroque violin, indistinctly labelled. Interesting. You don't often see a three-quarter Baroque violin. Looks like there's some funky things going on, but interesting nevertheless. Violin labelled Alberto Beduzzi. Violin unlabelled. Looks like a funky trade violin. Violin labelled Raphael and Antonio Galliano. Violin indistinctly labelled. Violin unlabelled. Violin labelled Antonio Stradivarius. Violin branded J. Zazvanil Kladno. Just have a look at the back again. Interesting. Violin labelled WM Webb. Violin unlabelled. Violin labelled manufactured in Berlin. Violin labelled Joseph Guarnerius. So I think it's a fairly interesting looking violin. And the scroll. That's one of the. Oh, let's have a look at the condition report again. There's a lot of repairs on that. New wood at the side, front half edged. I think it's an interesting looking violin. Violin labelled Matthias Neuner. Interesting crackliture on that as well. 3/4 size violin labelled Johannes Baptist Heveler. Violin labelled Albin Wilfer. I think we're going to run out of violins soon. I think we'll be on to books and things. Violin signed internally Richard Duke. Violin unlabelled. Violin labelled Antonius Stradivarius. 3/4 size violin branded Hopf. Violin Bridges book. Violin Makers Portrait of a Living Craft. Universal Dictionary of Violin and Bow Makers there. Stradivari book. Capo Lavori di Antonio Stradivari. Entente Internationale des Maîtres Luthiers and Architectes d'Art. That's interesting. Geometry Proportion in the Arts of Luthery. The Classic Lines of Italian Violin Making. Masterpieces of Italian Violin Making 1620 to 1850. Guarneri book there. Italian Violin Makers book. J.B. Vione book. Universal Dictionary of Violin and Bow Makers. Gio Paolo Magini, his life and work. Monograph collection. Dictionary of Violin and Bow Makers. Dictionary of British Violin and Bow Makers. The Cooper collection book. Benjamin Banks, the Salisbury Violin Makers 1727 to 1795, good book. History of the Viola. W.E. Hills and Sons Violin Makers 1880 to 1936. The Voller Brothers there. A music stand there. An antique violin case. A viola case unbranded. Violin case unbranded. Violin case branded W.E. Hills and Sons. Double violin case branded Withers, Sons and Co. It's quite a nice old case. Violin case branded W.E. Hills and Sons. Another case. 3 antique cases there. Let's see. Yeah. Violin case branded Gira. Bow case with space for 4 bows. Bow case with space for 4 bows again. Another bow case with space for 3 bows. Bow case with space for 8 bows. Bow case with space for 2 bows. Portrait, the quartet at a rehearsal by Leopold Loerstam, late 19th century. Interesting. Portrait of Niccolo Paganini. Framed print, Vanity Fair. Framed print, Vanity Fair. Another framed print, Vanity Fair. A framed print. That's actually fairly interesting. Another frame print here. What's this about? Fourth set of Oratorio's handle. Okay. And oh, is that it? I think we've got to the end. Is I think lot 282 may well be the last one. Let's just double check, because sometimes things can get a bit funny. Yeah, 282. So that's it. So that is the Amati affordable auction. Sorry, not the most exciting thing to go through. There's a lot of kind of unknowns really, but as you can see, a couple of kind of curious items in there. Some definitely with potential, but usually with like some horrible repairs, so it's all very speculative. But in any case, I'll put a link in description. Check it out and see what you think. And yeah, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Ciao. Many thanks for tuning in to the Musical Instrument Investigator. I hope that you enjoyed the video. If you did, then please like, subscribe and turn on notifications, and watch out for the next video coming soon.